Hello and good evening, everyone. I once again thank Overman Foundation for giving me the opportunity of speaking on Sri Aurobindo's The Future Poetry. We have been discussing the five sons of poetry, which, according to Sri Aurobindo, are truth, life, beauty, delight, and spirit. We have seen the role and importance of these in poetry, and today we shall discuss the power of the spirit and its function and meaning in poetic creation, and also its shaping influence in the life of a race and nation. Sri Aurobindo says the soul and mind of a race express itself best in its art and poetry, which is directly born from the spirit and is full with its power. And today, in our postmodern age, we are actually seeking for this. We are trying to express ourselves through the creative minds which can seize upon the spirit and truth of the spirit. And this can be done only when the mind of man transcends and goes beyond intellectualism, when it can release itself from the liberated intellect which has held it captive for almost 2 centuries. The mind of the race has to pursue the realization of the larger self. It has to shift from the scrutiny of the things that explain to the experiences of the things that reveal. That is, it has to seek the truths of the spirit. The progress of poetry of a nation is a good index of the progress of the cultural mind of that race. According to Sri Aurobindo, the progress of the mind of humanity takes place by a constant enlarging and transmutation of its experiences, and this is reflected in its self expression. And the human mind, in its progression, goes more and more inward till it can reach the inmost. But even then, the progress does not stop because the inmost is the infinite. So progress must go on. Uh, Humanity has enlarged its scope by a constant raising of the scale of the soul's experience. We are now risen to great heights of intellectual vision and activity. But now the question is, what next? What and where will the next step lead us in this scale of ascension? More importantly, shall we at all really and firmly take the next step in ascension, or shall we miss that only to fall back to another retracing of the psychological circuit? Sri Aurobindo asks us to ponder on this, as this, that is, what the mind of the race decides to do, shall determine the character of the future of the life of man and also of all his methods of aesthetic self expression. If poetry can be a product of the power of the spirit, it will voice eternal things, which will elevate us, raise our life to new experience. It will add new significance to our lives and raise us to great satisfied joy in experience. It will be the voice of the very self of man, the self of things, and the self of nature. In Sri Aurobindo's words, it will be, and I'm quoting, a creative and interpretative revelation of the infinite truth of existence and of the universal delight and beauty and of a greater spiritualized vision and power of life. Unquote. Above the intellect is the spirit, we know. So, the high developed intellect must open now to an understanding and seeing spirituality if it has to progress at all. We have to go beyond the obscure religionism of the past, which tied us to the lower levels of life, but had its bounds broken by the light of intellectual thought. So, to open to a spirituality will be a step towards an illumined self knowledge and God knowledge and a world knowledge. This will spiritualize our whole view of existence when it is transmuted in the greater light of seeing spirituality. That is one way the accomplished intellectualism of the human race may opt for and find its right consummation in its self exceeding. But there is also an alternative before the intellectual mind. In the continual changes, in the spinnings of the intellectual circle, which leads actually nowhere. Or else there may be a collapse again to the lower levels, which may bring down human civilization altogether to another intellectualized, corrupted barbarism. And Sri Aurobindo says that such catastrophes have occurred in world's history before, brought about by outward events and causes apparently. But the actual inner cause was the inability of the human intellect to find a way out of and beyond itself, out of the vital formula in which it could only exhaust itself and exhaust life. And it's not that this phase of civilization is passed over completely. On the contrary, there exists every possibility of the recurrence of such a catastrophe before us. And Sri Aurobindo draws our attention to two things here. On the one hand, the intellect, strained to its limits, has resulted in a recoil to a straining for unbridled, vital, emotional, sensational experience, and a morbid uh, disorder in the economy of nature. On the other hand, there are perturbations of the earth system which pose a threat to the mold of civilization, which may break up. So, the human race today is faced with a challenge whether it can create a new and greater mold of civilization under this threat or just collapse in its face, which will lead to a decadence and consequently a recommencement of the circle. But nothing to despair really, because Sri Aurobindo also gives us hope and assures us that we can overcome our civilizational crisis. But for that, the intellect has to be loyal to the larger perceptions of the greater self of humanity, of which it already has an intimation. And it has to turn its will to the forms of thought, art, and social endeavor which arise from these perceptions. And to avoid a great crisis, the intellectual mind must raise itself to the intuitive, supra intellectual, spiritual consciousness, which alone can build the base for a spiritualized life of the human race and help it to realize its diviner potentialities. So we may say spirituality is the key. And what is spirituality? So uh, let us define it in Sri Aurobindo's words. Sri Aurobindo says, spirituality means, and I'm quoting, a new and greater inner life of man, founded in the consciousness of his true, his inmost, highest, and largest self and spirit, by which he receives the whole of existence as a progressive manifestation of the self in the universe and his own life as a field of a possible transformation in which its divine sense will be found. its potentialities highly evolved, the now imperfect forms changed into an image of the divine perfection and an effort not only to see but to live out these greater possibilities of his being. Unquote. Now, here we have a good explanation of the term spirituality, which necessarily has to do with the inner life and progress and transformation and the realization of our divine possibilities. And once man becomes conscious of his true self, he can realize the oneness of all and the harmonious unity of the life with the spirit in nature and the universe. And the new poetry, the intuitive poetry, can greatly help in bringing about this change in the life of man because poetry will be more than mere abstraction of thought. It will give something concrete and living to the imagination by creating in words and images, and a thing of beauty and delight it will be, which the soul of man shall accept. Today, our intellect, which is fixed mainly on the external physical world, has taken from us our sense of the eternal. We have lost our inner vision and cannot feel the presence of the divine because of the overemphasis on the intellect. The poetry of the spirit shall restore to us this sense of the divine in the voice of the intuitive experience and rhythm, revealing the eternal presence. It will discard the tones of conventional religion of the past. This poetry will speak of new things or even of old things, but in a new way. The voice of this new poetry will be a new voice attained by a great heightening above, a great intimacy within, a great enlargement and wideness all around. It shall have the vision of inmost things and reveal them. It will give us a changed vision of the world and life and tell us of the untold potentialities of the soul's experience. The voice of the new poet shall reveal to us God, the divinity in man, and the life of the universe. This poetry will express the delight of man when he endeavors to discover the touch of the divinity within him, which is the fount of his life and being, and finds his unity with all creatures and with all nature. The strains of this new poetry are already there in the creations of poets like Tagore, uh, Carpenter, Walt Whitman, George Russell. So let us just listen to some revealing voices of the new poets who sing from the soul, drawing from their inmost vision. So look at these lines of poetry where the poet says, "Yes, I know this is nothing but thy love. O beloved of my heart, this golden light that dances upon the leaves, these idle clouds sailing across the sky, this passing breeze leaving its coolness upon my forehead, the morning light has flooded my eyes. This is thy message to my heart. Thy face is bent from above, thy eyes look down on my eyes, and my heart has touched thy feet." So, this is the voice of Tagore uh, from his Gitanjali, the supreme singer, Tagore, who was a great poet and singer. Okay, so now we can also listen to uh, this Song of the Soul by Walt Whitman, where he's writing, and see the notice the absolute simplicity of the words of the language. And Whitman says, I see something of God in each hour of the 24, and each moment then, in the faces of men and women, I see God, and in my own face in the glass. I find letters from God dropped in the street, and everyone is signed by God's name. And I leave them where they are, for I know that wheresoever I go, others will punctually come forever and ever. So, this is from his Songs of Myself. Now, these are some new strains in poetry, and Sri Aurobindo says this will grow into a fuller and more intimate poetic knowledge and vision in the future. Poetry will be more inclusive. It will embrace more and more everything in our inner and outer existence till all life is brought within the mold of the spiritual sense. Poetry of this kind is what is needed, and it is what all art should be. And what should all art be? Sri Aurobindo says it is a thing of harmony and joy and illumination, a solution and release of the soul from its vital unrest and questioning and struggle, not by ignoring of these things, but by an uplifting into the strength of the self within and the light and air of its greater view, where there is found not only the point of escape, but the supporting calmness and power of a seated knowledge, mastery, and deliverance. So we see in the greatest art, there must be something of the impersonal, which elevates the struggle of the personality, something of the largeness of the universal, releasing and harmonizing of the individual existence. There has to be something of the sense of the transcendent, raising the inferior and uncertain powers of life towards a greater life and Anand. And when art and poetry can express the fullest sense of these things, then they can become the builders of the soul of man. But that is future poetry. We want, we need, we expect the poetry of the future to be the fortifier of our lives. The poetry of the Eastern cultures exhibits some of these deeper traits, as it is a creation of a larger and quieter spirit. It has been intensely responsive to the deeper psychic findings and expressed the subtle harmonies of the soul's experience. This is especially true of the art and poetry of the Far East, Sri Aurobindo says. The Indian poets, too, expressed the greatness of thought and life and also penetrated the surface to seek and express the communion of the human soul with the eternal. And this came about in spite of the ascetic creed of illusionism. In comparison, we find the poetry of Europe restless, troubled, and without the certainty of happiness and repose. Though we hear sometimes the intensely eager and moved voice of the poet, we also find him afflicted by the grief and tragedy of life. And we find him expressing in his poetry this unrest, discord, and incertitude. Thus, European poetry generally could not be capable of anything but lesser harmonies. It could not produce anything of great satisfaction. Of course, exceptions are there. So we see, we've talked about how early poetry gave us the picture of the surface life, the delight of the forms and beauty of nature. There hardly do we find expressed the inner communion between man and nature or the universe. Later, however, as poetry progressed, there was seen more of the subtleties of the vital soul of manifested nature. The poet expressed his response of his life spirit to nature. This perhaps led to the emergence of the intellectual and aesthetic sense of the subtler and profounder elements in nature, the expression of which we find in the poetry of, say, Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, and a few others. So let's consider some beautiful lines of poetry by Keats here, which he addresses to the bright star. Not in lone splendor hung aloft the night, and watching with eternal lids apart, like nature's patient, sleepless eremite, the moving waters at their priest-like task of pure ablution round earth's human shores, or gazing on the new soft fallen mask of snow upon the mountains and the moors. No, yet still steadfast, still unchangeable, pillowed upon my fair love's ripening breast, to feel for ever its soft fall and swell, awake for ever in a sweet unrest. Beautiful lines of poetry here. And here we also see an attempt at communion with the spirit in nature and the finding of the living presence of light and love and power and conscious delight and beauty. But poetry cannot stop here. It must further carry on this task. The more intimate poetry will make of these things the material and subject of a greater sense and vision, and also make man aware of the soul and spirit of nature, give us intimation of the profound psychic suggestions and of all that lies veiled but is revealed to the soul, which has found its unity with the universal spirit. Now, at this point, Sri Aurobindo gives a long and interesting discourse on the future characteristics and possibilities of poetry. So, let us follow him in his predictions of future poetry. So, as he says, the future mind, free from its present limitations, will be more intuitive and feel its unity with other consciousness in nature and hear the voice which is now mute to it. Feel the soul and life of things which now seem lifeless. It will feel the soul and life of all existence in the universe, of the soul of the animal world, of the plant kingdom, of all that grow in silence. It will interpret not only these, not only man and terrestrial nature, but it will explore and interpret other domains of the spirit too. Poetry of the future will gather into itself and reconcile all past strains in its intensity and largeness and will offer a better aesthetic and spiritual satisfaction. It will be more expressive of things absolute, infinite, more potent. This kind of poetry will also bring newer depths of the intimacies of the soul with nature. The future poetry will open to us the worlds of supernature also and allow us to participate in the life of other domains of existence the psychic kingdoms which are now hidden from us, the vaster realms of the self, and also acquaint us with the powers of the universe that stand behind our surface life. And this, the poet of the future will do with the directness that comes from intimate vision and experience. Unlike the past and old poets who took recourse in symbols or romantic glamour or mystic remoteness, the new poet shall make his visions and realizations a part of the living experience. So let us listen to Sri Aurobindo, who is a future poet, and in some lines from Savitri here, where he's describing a secret, rather veiled realm of existence, of which he, the yogi, has an experience. It is the idols' kingdoms, and is describing their beauty and greatness and glory and splendor. And I'm quoting just a few lines. And Sri Aurobindo writes in Savitri, in each a seraph winged, high browed idea, united all knowledge by one master thought, persuaded all action to one golden sense, all powers subjected to a single power, and made a world where it could reign alone, an absolute ideal's perfect home. Of course, this perfect home is invisible and veiled from the common eye. But the poet, the future poet who has had a realization of this, can write like this. So, the poetry of spiritual inspiration must be futurist in its insistence, even when dealing with the common life of things and not things eternal directly. The new poet will transfigure the past without any obligation to live in an imaginative preoccupation with the past. One who can live in the spirit can distinguish the eternal from the momentary and the transient, and can see in the transient forms too a revelation of the spirit's greater significance. Sri Aurobindo had written elsewhere that the spiritual vision always gives the sense of something vivid, living, and concrete, something of vibrant beauty and power. The new poet shall search all the ways of life and interpret and reveal to man the divinity in all its guises, in all its manifestations. He shall segregate and disengage the struggling and the untransformed outside and surface of things, and find a deeper aesthesis in even the ugly and the terrible, and make out of it a thing of beauty and truth by his poetic sympathy. So we do find something of this trend in modern poetry. We have discussed this before, but then uh, till now it is a bit immature in that it does not possess sufficient fineness of insight and handles its poetic material in a crude way. But once it can get over these faults, it shall hold an assured place among the great poetic motives. And Sri Aurobindo says the spiritual experience has a luminous and assured clarity of its own. The spiritual vision is not only of the divinity in man as he is, or of the divinity in his struggles and failures and victories, but the spirit is master of the future as also of the past and present in time in a very profound sense. And our future is more and more seen as the growth of the Godhead in man. And that is the fate of the human race, says Sri Aurobindo, as it thinks and wills and labors towards its own perfection. So, the poetry of the future will be a clearer and more inspiring vision of the destiny of the spirit in man. In this poetry, we shall hear more and more the the song of the growing godhead, of the kind of human unity, of spiritual freedom, of the coming supermanhood of man, of the divine ideal seeking to actualize itself in the life of the earth, of the call to the individual to rise to his godlike possibility, and to the race to live in the greatness of that which humanity feels within itself as a power of the spirit, which it has to deliver into some yet ungrasped perfect form of clearness. This is what Sri Aurobindo writes. So the coming age promises us new voices in poetry, which shall be the result of the growth of the power of the spirit on the mind of man. The poetic utterance is ever shaped by the spirit, and a poet is great according to the power of his vision by which he makes the common life and surroundings beautiful and noble. And when the intellect of the great poet labors to create, we get profound, enlightening ideas and a creative interpretation of the world and nature and man and existence. But we get profounder things in poetic creation when the great poet makes use of his intuitive will and vision. And here we get in and through his poetry the inmost sense of things, the inmost consciousness of nature, the deepest soul of man is revealed to us, the meaning of existence is revealed to us. Intuitive poetry reveals the truth, the universal delight and beauty, and the power of a greater life, and also the infinite potentialities of our experience and self creation beyond what the mind can dream. So, listen to Sri Aurobindo's lines, which exemplify these characteristics of future poetry. And in Savitri, he writes, their breath carried a stream of seeing mind. Form was a tenuous raiment of the soul. Color was a visible tone of ecstasy, shapes seen half immaterial by the gaze, and yet voluptuously palpable, made sensible to touch the indwelling spirit. And that, of course, is a task of the future poet. So these strains will be visible in the poetry of the future, certainly. And there may be many others. But Sri Aurobindo says these will be the greatest and they will influence all the rest by opening new vistas for man. And this is what the highest human mind will demand from its greatest poets. And whatever be the subject and theme of the poet, the growth of the power of the spirit shall bring into poetry a more intense and revealing speech, a more subtle and penetrating rhythm, a more vibrant and responsive sense. There shall be greater stress of sight, and the eye of the poet shall roll from heaven to earth surely, but look for the significances that have not yet been discovered, the secrets which are deep hid till now, and he'll not only on the surface will he look. That will be the mark of the future poetry, the new utterance. And to the inspiration of the future humanity is left the boundless field of poetic discovery. Sri Aurobindo says all this about future poetry. The poet may represent the highest point of mental seership even now, but must progressively be a spiritual seer of the future, because art has a high purpose, a high function. The most outward function of art, according to Sri Aurobindo, is to embellish life with beauty. Its higher task is to make life more intimately beautiful and noble and great and full of meaning. But the highest function of the poet will be fulfilled when the poet becomes the seer and reveals to man his eternal self and the godheads of its manifestation. So we do wait for the birth of the new poet, the future poet. And going by the definition and explanation of the function of poetry as given by Sri Aurobindo, we can venture to say that the next step in progress will be beyond human intellect. And we may hope to find our salvation in spirituality, in the worship of delight and beauty. So, thank you so much for today.